Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. It's really my honor today to host Professor Hani Mahmassani to share with us his recent research on telemobility, hybrid work, and the next normal. As researchers, we have many dreams. One of them is to conduct social experiment, right? But rarely we have the opportunity to do a global scale, coordinated, and mandatory experiment. And here we are, COVID-19 and a mass adoption of telemobility. So what does it mean for cities and for urban mobility? And how does it mean differently for different group of people? And which of the changes are transitory versus structural and haven't reached the equilibrium yet or will ever reach it? So no other scholar better than Professor Hani Mahmassani to help us really understand this set of puzzles and questions, right? Before I formally introduce Professor Mahmassani, I want to reinforce the norm of this forum, which is everyone participate and contribute one idea. Please type in the chat either one question or one comment to Professor Mahmassani's presentation, right? Either one question or one comment. But I expect everybody to contribute idea to make this forum much more lively than the typical we see in the online sessions there. So here, before I get to the introduction, I also want to do two quick polls given today's topic, right? So I'm launching the first one here, which asks you about the number of days you are doing remote working per week as of now, right?
There was no 7.
Right. So we'll have 200 responses now. I'll give 5 more seconds. Okay, I'll stop the poll and share the result. Hani, can you see the result?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So hopefully, give you some context here. It's quite actually evenly distributed across the other options there. So I'll stop that, and I'll do a second poll, which is still about remote working, but it's about your preference. So what you would like to do in terms of remote working, in terms of number of days. All right, so I'll close the poll and share. There's a clear concentration of 3 days a week in terms preference of remote working. Great, thank you. Yeah. So when I conduct this prior poll, some people told me that, Jinhua, you know that as a survey designer, this is not scientific, right? I totally with you. The point of this survey is not science; it's about engagement. It means that people can participate and get exercise for today's topic. So Hani Mahmassani is a William Patterson Distinguished Professor and Director of Transportation Center at Northwestern University. He's instrumental to the whole field of transportation. He substantively contributed to a broad array of key research areas, such as multimodal traffic system analysis and operation, intelligent transportation system, real-time estimation and prediction, and dynamic network model and traffic science. Currently, his research focuses on the connected and autonomous vehicle deployment, include fleet operation for emerging mobility services, post-pandemic impact on travel demand, and urban air mobility and transportation system decarbonization. He was the editor-in-chief of Transportation Science, the senior editor of IEEE Transactions on Intelligent Transportation System. He was the president of Transportation Science section of Informs and president of the International Association for Travel Behavior Research. He received numerous awards, including the Distinguished Alumni Award from Purdue University, the IEEE Intelligent Transportation System Outstanding Application Award, and TRB's Thomas Dean Distinguished Lectureship. And he was recently elected to the National Academy of Engineering for contribution to modeling of intelligent transportation network and to interdisciplinary collaboration in transportation engineering. So Professor Hani Mahmassani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jinwa, for the invitation and for also accommodating my constraints earlier in the fall and rescheduling me for this period. One thing that I noticed on this poll, which is quite interesting, is that of those who had said 5, in the first response, 24% had said 5 days. And in the preference poll, 5 dropped to 17%, and they went to 3. So there are people who are working remotely who really would rather be in person at least part of the time. And I think that's an interesting finding that you have here. I'm delighted to be with this group of friends here and colleagues. It's nice to see names I have not seen in some time. So thank you for joining us. This is an area where, of course, that is still evolving, and it's evolving fairly rapidly. Many of us in this community are trying to document some part of it so that maybe collectively we can have a more complete view of how work is evolving and how our engagement with information communication technologies is also evolving jointly with our engagement in the in the physical world. And so let me share my screen here. I must say that Jinwa pulled one on me, because I kind of was preparing for a longer talk, and then I finally read the emails carefully, and it said limited to 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to do that, which means I'm going to go over some items fairly quickly here. Okay, so the motivation is really perhaps motivation for the series. Through the COVID experiment, we did live through a broad, deep, and long natural experiment in using ICT. The impacts, of course, on how we work, play, shop, seek medical assistance are still unfolding. What can we learn from that experiment? Where do we go from here? What's sticking? How is it morphing? Are we there yet? And by all indications, we're not quite there at that presumed equilibrium that might eventually be reached. And the focus here today is on telework, on hybrid work, and simply work, really, just what is happening to downtown offices, commuting patterns, public transport, and what kind of next normal might lie ahead. As I guess modelers and planners, we ask, are we sticking to the same old, perhaps not so useful models for mobility planning given the unfolding scenarios? And that's a question for all of us here who are in the business of either developing or applying models to support planning decisions. A lot of the work that I'm describing was performed through an opportunity we had through the UTC program, which now has concluded. That was a short UTC, that was a topical one on telemobility. And I'd like to, and most of the work I'm presenting today is joint work with a terrific team that at Northwestern included Professor Amanda Statopoulos, and at UC Berkeley included Susan Shaheen and John Walker, and several PhD candidates, particularly Divyakant Talian, who is on the call today, Maher Saeed, Nadim Hamad, and at Berkeley, Alexandra Pan. Most of the technical slides I'm using today are courtesy of Divyakant. A lot of this work is actually part of his dissertation. So thank you, Divyakant, for all your help. As we sort of set out to examine the broader questions of where we're heading with telemobility, our premise was that you really cannot understand the demand side without understanding the supply side. If you look at e-commerce, yes, there's shopping engagement, shopping behavior, but ultimately what are retailers doing? Similarly, if you look at telehealth engagement, yes, there's the consumer side, but at the same time, what are healthcare providers offering? And as we look at telework, we cannot simply look at the employee side or the worker side. We have to look at what employers ultimately are doing, because the outcome that we see is the result of interaction between, quote, the supplier and the demander, if you wish. There is also another key, I guess, premise here is there's a symbiotic interplay between virtual and physical world. This is one item that had been a research agenda for the TRB, ICT, and Travel Behavior Committee for many years since Pat Mokhtarian founded it. So we're looking at many years of engagement there, and so that was the pandemic was an important milestone in a process that had been ongoing for a long time. So both adoption, engagement, use of ICT activity channels cannot be examined independently of engagement with sort of real physical world activity as well. And the process is highly dynamic. It is still evolving. And again, what our work is an attempt to capture various snapshots of that evolution. The high-level framework for examining the transportation and travel demand impacts of e-activities, again, has if you look at the different areas of e-activity, whether it's esports and gaming, telemedicine, e-learning, telework, e-commerce, all these verticals, if you wish, they all have a supplier side, which are the firm decisions, and they have a demand side, which is the individual and household demand in terms of e-activity adoption and engagement and virtual physical activity engagement and interplay. And of course, this is all in interaction with what we do, which is the transportation supply side, and that ultimately determines the travel impacts and under the influence of whatever policy interventions might be called for. So focusing on our main items today, we're focusing on telework, hybrid work, and really the next normal when it comes to work. And there are 4 questions here that we're addressing. The first one is, for whom did telework not work during the pandemic? This is from an employee perspective. Then we look at it from the employer's perspective with looking at, again, how employers are envisioning the future of work. Then additionally, we examine some of the same questions from the teleworkers' perspective in terms of how they have evolved through the pandemic and beyond, from at one point before the pandemic, working largely in person and in offices, to their trajectory until where we are today in terms of various forms of hybrid and so on. And then depending on time, there's a very important question now, which is from a travel behavior standpoint, which is, what do teleworkers do ultimately? How do they spend their time? When do they travel? How far do they travel, etc.? And we have one attempt here at characterizing that engagement, and it's still in very early stages of development. Okay, to provide information for these 4 questions, we have conducted an employee tracking survey, or rather a household tracking survey of 7 waves. We started in December 2020, and we were going every 2 weeks for the first 6 waves. And then a year later, in March 2022, we went back to some of the same people, some additional one, and asked them more questions to see what kind of evolution we've had. And in those surveys, we were asking about a behavior as manifested through expenditures, through the use of deliveries, through the travel behavior in terms of discretionary trips, in terms of where they are working, and also various attitudinal questions related to COVID-19, fears at the time of of contracting COVID, and so on. And we did later, particularly in waves 7 and 6, we included an activity diary looking of teleworkers to see how they're when they're traveling and what they have been doing. We also conducted a survey. I'm sorry, I'm dealing with Zoom here. A tracking survey of employers, and we were able to conduct 5 waves of high-level employers. And high level, these are all C-level folks. It's a relatively small sample, but they have, they're, and then it's not necessarily representative of all industry sectors, because we do have a preponderance of transportation-related companies, because one of the key sources was the Business Advisory Council of our transportation center. But we did have a range of sizes and so on, and we were able to track their plans for return to work. And those waves were conducted between October 2021 and August 2022, and I'll show you the results later. So I'm going to start with the first question on employee satisfaction with remote work, and that was one of sort of the first papers that we published from that work. It's in Transportation Research Part A. The idea here is that, we asked them just how satisfied were they with telework, to the extent that many were engaged in that. And for some cases, it was a hypothetical, but for many of them, they were engaged in that. And you can see the distribution of responses. And in fact, only 74.2% said being somewhat or very satisfied. Of course, a high percentage, but not everybody was satisfied. And we wanted to kind of probe more deeply into that. And there were a set of attitudinal questions and perceptions that we asked of these folks. And so we examined this with two types of models. First one is a very simple one. It's an ordered probit model of just what the response that they provided, whether they're dissatisfied, neither dissatisfied or satisfied, somewhat satisfied, and very satisfied. And that's a model where you estimate a propensity, essentially, or a satisfaction index as a function of various of different covariates with threshold that then determine your response into these different categories. And one element that you see here, so it's the variables that were ultimately included that indicated satisfaction. The first one that struck me was really the effect of age here, and we included age and age square. We wanted to kind of see the pattern here, but when you look at this, you find that satisfaction propensity, in fact, tends to be somewhat lower for younger individuals and somewhat lower for older individuals. And in the middle, there seemed to be the most satisfaction. And for young folks, basically, they were missing the networking and career advancement and so on. And for the older folks, all they are used to is going to work every day and kind of, not quite as comfortable either with the technology or with the whole sort of process. And other factors that entered, that were significant. There was lower satisfaction for those who had children attending online school, not surprising. It was also lower for those with at least an undergraduate degree, but not higher for individual with a graduate degree. And there seems to be higher satisfaction for individuals with Hispanic ethnicity. It wasn't entirely clear for us why that might be the case. For suburban households, they tended to be more satisfied because they didn't have to commute to work. They had longer commutes typically, or there may have been a relocation effect. And those, of course, who were worried about catching COVID were more satisfied with working remotely, not surprisingly. We then built a more elaborate model where we identified latent factors that explain, that reflect the attitudes. And two latent factors stood out, one that could be viewed as perceived telework benefits, the other that could be the perceived telework barriers. And the things that go into the benefits include perception of work productivity, productivity gains, time savings due to not needing to commute, a perception of quality of life improvement, one's job remote, so those who had a job that was more suitable for remote execution, perceived a benefit, and the flexibility in terms of work location. Those who who had more barriers had to do with technology, the distraction factor from other household members. Again, the job may not be that suitable, and also the work location flexibility. And so the model ultimately had these two latent factors with the various components. And we're not going to go through all the details. Those are in the paper, but you get sort of, you get the general idea of what that model was capturing. And so of course, higher experience benefits leads to higher satisfaction. Higher experience barriers leads to lower satisfaction. Nothing too profound there. So the key insights from that analysis is that the benefits and barriers to telework seem to be disproportionately distributed across age groups, with younger and older individuals experiencing lower benefits and higher barriers, at least in the case of older individuals, leading to lower satisfaction. Presence of children attending online school from home was a factor driving, in that case, dissatisfaction. Potential presence of inequity along the lines of racial and ethnic identity. There's clearly an equity angle here as well. We found that individuals with Black ethnicity experienced lower benefits to telework, and those with Hispanic Latino ethnicity experienced higher satisfaction, potentially related to being disproportionately employed in maybe telework unfriendly sectors, so they perceive the ability to telework to be less or more beneficial in that sense. But we did not really have enough data to probe into these questions. So that's the first set of questions addressed. The second one had to do with the employer's perspective, and this is the tracking survey of employers. And what we have here is the average. Think of it as a GPA essentially, where we go from fully remote to fully in person. Each one is one additional point, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you could see that in September 2019, pre-COVID, the average was right around mostly in person. April 2020 dropped to somewhere between mostly and fully remote, and then that continued to increase. And what we have here is for each wave, we're showing the actual numbers, and and you could see the changes. For instance, in wave 1, when we asked people about January 2022, that was looking ahead. And when we actually asked wave 3 after it had happened, we found that the expectation earlier was they would be more back in person. And in fact, in January 2022, they were still considerably below that. That's the yellow triangle compared to the green cross there. And we've asked every wave where they thought they were going to be in April 2024, and you could see it moving back up towards mostly in person, but still still a 0.4, 0.2 drop compared to pre-pandemic, and you could see some fluctuation around that point. But clearly, from the employer perspective, they're envisioning more of a hybrid mode, though perhaps slanted more towards in person than otherwise. But there's a catch here, because over 50% of our respondents were in the transportation and manufacturing sector. And these industries tend to be more closer to the physical world, even management. And we're asking now about the jobs that could be done remotely. We're not asking them about can you drive the truck remotely, at least not yet, until we have full automation there. But and so we're asking about the jobs that could be done remotely, and the transportation industry likes to be closer to what is moving ultimately. And so if you work for an airline, if you work for a trucking firm, railroad, and so on, those types of firms have wanted their management to be back in person to interact with the folks who are in fact moving the goods. Okay, so there's a clear distinction here between the transportation and manufacturing sector and others. We did ask employers about their opinion if we had sort of a 2 days a week remote work policy and what the impact might be. And so this is in decreasing order of positiveness. And clearly in terms of recruitment and retention of employees, they view that as as highly positive, public image that's positive, ability to compete, viability, productivity keeps going down. When it comes to creativity, we see a significant drop there. When it comes to ability to innovate and ability to supervise, that's where employers seem to have concerns. And we ran a latent class model with essentially the two classes being positive outlook and negative outlook. Kind of tended to split down the middle there in terms of the attitudes and perceptions of employers. Okay, so we are then so we're trying to predict the 2024 remote work strategy. Again, the response there is from fully remote to fully in person, and in this case, we estimated again propensity towards being fully in person, including various characteristics of these companies. And you can see here on the right the distribution of responses, but the sort of key significant variables here is that, if you're in the transportation, warehousing, and manufacturing sector, that's, high propensity. If you were fully in person pre-COVID, higher propensity towards in person. If you have shifted from fully in person pre-COVID to fully remote, that was shift, more towards remote work. And when we interacted the warehousing manufacturing indicator with the shift, that still came out positive. So even in the transportation warehousing sector, those that were able to make a full shift to virtual work in April are still less likely to be in person. And so watch that space, but we're seeing remarkable sort of convergence at this point of what at least the next year or two might look like. We asked employers what their view is of what employees really want. And in fact, this seems to be fairly reflective of what we're hearing from employees as well. So employers seem to have a good view there. In their case, they realize that 46% prefer hybrid, with 26.7% preferring remote, or at least this is how, this is the percentage, yes, of employees as perceived by the employers that are interested in or have preferences for these work locations. So that's number two. Number three, trajectories of teleworkers to the pandemic. And so this is a more elaborate analysis that Divya Kant has recently completed. This is working mostly with the using the 7-wave longitudinal tracking panel, which ultimately had over 1,800 unique respondents. And we tried to track what their telework trajectory was. So as we were asking employers, we now asked all of the employee respondents how they were working. And so dark green is exclusively at the office. And this is starting in 2019, going to April 2020, all the way to then their prediction for April 2024. In fact, the last data item was March 2022. October was a prediction, but then we kind of wanted to see where they saw themselves in April 2024. So dark green is exclusively at the office, lighter green is mostly at the office, and then the yellow is about 50-50, and then the various shades of red and burgundy are from mostly at home to exclusively at home, and then you have some who do not know where they're going to be in 2024 or where it's just not applicable to them. So we left those out. But you could clearly see in 2019, those that were exclusively at the office and sort of their trajectories versus those that were previously mostly at home and their trajectories, and then all of the various hybrids. So we did several analyses on these, one of which is a trajectory clustering analysis of the trajectory through these different stages. Another was to do a classification of latent classes in terms of their outlook towards remote work, and then also estimated a cluster membership model. These are the clusters that have to do with the work location clusters, and then ultimately try to predict where they're going to be in April 2024. And so four classes emerged here in terms of the various trajectories. Those who are primarily in-person workers, and that's about 25.2%. Then you have two types of hybrids, the level 1 and the level 2. The main difference is that the level 1 are skewing more towards kind of returning back to the office, whereas the level 2 seem to have more remote along their trajectory. And then you have about 35% that are sort of your remote workers. Not pre-COVID, but that are kind of during and then have continued post-pandemic as remote workers. And if you kind of look at the trajectories there of these classes, again, you could see those who are mostly at the office, and then the two hybrids that seem to be converging, and then the class that's mostly at home or working remotely, and where they see themselves sort of going. And these are the actual trajectories, not the future projection. We asked also their opinion of what the impact of remote work might be on their productivity, creativity, effectiveness. They don't feel they are less able to innovate or to create like the employers do. On the other hand, where they do not have as much of a positive opinion is when it comes to social interaction and career advancement, and to some extent the ability to receive mentoring. And we came up again with latent classes for those. In this case, the data supported 6 classes of responses. And we did use a prediction model for then April 2024. And what you could see, again, not surprisingly, that those who are in cluster 4, for instance, tend to be much, again, less likely to be back in person. Again, positive here means towards in person, negative is more remote. And then, the influence of these kind of latent the classes there is clear and is very much in the direction that one expects. When we also added the opinion indicators, those that have a negative outlook towards remote work, again, are scoring positively towards in-person. And you could see some of these other variables there in terms of the occupational sector. Those who tend to be more in technology, finance, and so on are more on the remote side. Those who are in transportation, manufacturing, the more physical areas tend to be more on the in-person side. So, it turns out that zero-vehicle households are, expecting to be more remote, which is, of course, not too surprising. We've also found sort of a consistent age effect with, in this case, 65 plus towards more remote, 44 and below being more in person. So key takeaways from this is that future telework trends will vary by occupational sectors, as we've discussed previously, age effect, zero vehicle households, and of course, employer decisions will play a critical role in this particular process. And the last item is a very short one. What are hybrid workers doing or when they are working remotely? And because that's crucial to travel behavior and to predicting travel patterns at the urban metropolitan level. And so we're looking at how out-of-home non-work activity patterns differ across teleworkers and non-teleworkers. This is essentially maintaining a diary on a particular on a particular day where the day was randomized across the respondents. So we get sort of each day of the week. So we're looking at activity types, at activity locations, distance from home, and the mode that may be used to reach each activity. And we're asking if the effect of telework on the duration spent out of home, on average distance traveled, and kind of time of day to engage in out-of-home non-work activities. And this is still a very exploratory analysis. We have a lot of data. We haven't run any of the sophisticated, joint models with latent groups and so on. But just some initial results is that teleworkers are spending less time out of home for non-work activities. We were not kind of sure about that, but the data seems to be very clear here. And teleworkers are traveling shorter distance for out-of-home non-work activities. So there just seems to be more closer to home activities. And it seems also that they choose to perform activities in the early afternoon, 12 to 3 p.m., and evening, 6 to 9 p.m., compared to other times of the day and compared to non-teleworking individuals. And mind you, these are not people who are teleworking 5 days a week necessarily. It's on a day that they are working remotely. And so that includes most of our hybrid worker respondents. And so that's kind of the summary of the results. Of course, the next question is, where do we go from here? What should cities, agencies, and POs be planning for? And Susan Shaheen and Alexandra Pan at Berkeley conducted a scenario planning exercise about the next normal. And we kind of, if you kind of classify the location and policies here along 2 dimensions, the old normal had rigid work policies and centralized work locations. The disruption during the pandemic put us in still rigid work policies, but decentralized. The new normal that we're still kind of going through has had more decentralization and more flexibility in work policies. And then the question is, where is the next normal? Are we going to more flexibility, but perhaps a little more centralization than complete decentralization? And so the actual point where that next normal is going to be is up for grabs, essentially, and has very significant implications ultimately for two items that we're getting to. So still much uncertainty in the future of work. There's the push and pull between employers and employees likely to continue. The most likely scenario on the horizon is hybrid 2 days remote, though pressures for in-person and flex are strong. So even as we go back to more in-person, flexibility is here to stay. And technology is now widely available. Everybody has access to Zoom or similar technology, which pre-pandemic we did not have. But the key impacted areas for us is urban cores. Downtown office space is still in flux, varies across cities depending on degree of amenity and how rich that urban core is in terms of the arts and so on, restaurants and what have you, because the work kind of flow is not quite there yet. So it's a very uneven recovery. And of course, conventional public transit is still losing in this stage, still below 60% of pre-pandemic levels in most cities in the US. Winners so far, TNCs. Some neighborhoods are thriving, including in the suburbs, freight, and leisure travel back to experiences. And the question for us is then, what's the transportation planners toolkit, is it even, I'm sorry, maybe I'm being too strong here, less relevant today than pre-pandemic, but they're badly needed to step up because our agencies need help in this arena. And, we need more investment ultimately to collect data and develop tools that can support intelligent decisions in what is still an important opportunity. And so with that, I thank you and move on to the questions.
Thank you so much, Hani. I know you packed 2 hours of material in within half an hour. So let me invite the 3 audience to give a short remarks. Frank Levy as the economist, Michael Schiffer as a senior executive in New York MTA, and Chandra Bard as an engineer. So Frank, please.
Well, it was an enormous amount of information. It was a very interesting presentation. My one reaction is that I think that what we're seeing now is itself very much in transition, in the sense that most of the workers involved in that are being observed have been with organizations for a while, and so they've had a chance to be settled in and learn the routines of the organization in which they're working, and managers kind of know what they're capable of doing. Now, over time, as you're integrating new people into the firm, there's a question of how well they'll be socialized into the firm's routines, and how easy it will be for managers to understand what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And so the idea that the current kind of flexibility carries you into the future, even as you're trying to integrate more people in, that's not so clear to me. So that's the point I would raise.
Great, thanks, Frank. Michael?
So thanks very much, Zhenhua, and thanks, Hani, for bringing such structure to this. It's really, an interesting and ongoing, rich area to investigate that I don't think any of us anticipated we'd be investigating 5 years ago. Our ridership here in New York at the MTA is slowly climbing from 60 to 70%. So that's the good news compared to pre-pandemic levels. And ridership first came back in the off-peak and weekends on bus and subway, later the railroads, and most of the growth recently has interestingly been in the peak of the peak. We've seen that come back. As you can imagine, Mondays and Fridays aren't as strong as the middle of the week, but they're not as weak as people would imagine either. Not to the point where you'd want to rethink the schedules here anyway, because they're pretty close, a few points off here and there. So that's kind of interesting. And really what we see is, of course, a lot of differential in terms of geography, and that's largely a function of where people have kind of settled, and in particular, what kinds of job industries people are representing geographically. So the real driver of ridership, as you put your finger on it, Hani, is really the office market, right, in CBDs. And as you can imagine, office markets behave differently. I think you touched on it when you mentioned the difference between, say, suburban office markets and central business district office markets. We're very interested in that as we redesign and rethink aspects of our service. And even within the CBD, you see different office sectors, such as banking, finance, media, professional, who behave differently. Some of these industries appear to thrive more on the agglomeration and collaboration than others. And finally, return to office in even a given market can be different depending on the geography. So IT in the Bay Area may be different than, say, IT in New York City. So I think the point is that, we appear to see some distinctions in return to transit across the country. And that's driven by things such as price and availability, parking in some cities versus denser agglomerations in others. I think the main point that I just wanted to make is it's obviously it's always tempting to generalize, but hard to generalize across metropolitan areas in the United States. And we'd be very interested in the academics represented here in the future research that really draws out some of these geographic distinctions. So thanks again very much for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Michael. Chandra?
Well, thank you, Hani, as always, very interesting. By the way, from a terminology standpoint, I really appreciated your use of the term the next normal. I really prefer that way to the new normal, because the new normal has this connotation that it's going to be stable, and we know that it's still evolving. So I really enjoyed the use of the term the next normal. Just three or four other points. By the way, we had some results about age, Hani, that were consistent with what you found. And we were able to justify it based on some gerontology literature, human development literature. If we have time, we can talk about that. But to my main thoughts here, one of the issues that comes with all of this analysis is, in a lot of planning, we have been talking about the average workday. And in an average workday, we can talk about a binary switch. Did you work at home or did you not work at home? And now we are talking about hybrid work over longer periods of time. And so how do we consummate that with this longer term hybrid work kind of a inclination with our average weekday models, single weekday models? Or now is it now the time to start thinking about multi-day models? I think that's something that does arise over here. And related to that, in some of our work, we are finding that the hybrid work, how much you work from home and how much you work from elsewhere, over a period of a month, that seems to have a substantial impact on even our dining patterns, our non-work patterns over time. So, do I cook in the home, or do I go eat out, or do I have delivery, or do I take out? That seems to be substantially impacted by the hybrid over a longer period of time. So I think the impacts of this are going to be, we are still searching and trying to understand, but I think it's going to be relatively far-fetched in the long span of time in the future. The third thing I had is, this tussle, Hani, you brought up. Maybe it's not, the tussle is not a right word, but this tension or this interplay probably between employers and employees, I think that's really, really interesting. We had these terms of the Great Resignation, the idea being that employees wielded all the power. And now we're talking about the boomerang employees, where employees are realizing, oh, you know what? I should not have left the company in the first place. And so they're coming back. So I think this interplay is going to be really interesting, how it plays out. The last thing I'll say is, to Alan's point, are people who are now able to telework more, are they relocating farther away, for example, from their workplace? I think that's an interesting conundrum we are having, given the data we are having, because, is it that teleworking is encouraging residential relocation, or is it that people who are very far away from their workplace are starting to telework more? What's the directionality of the effect? I think that we'll need some panel over time to ascertain. But thank you, I appreciate it. Let me stop here because I know the audience has got so many comments too.
Thank you, Chandra. Yeah, Hani, given the limited time, right? So we'll add my 2 comments. I will let you respond to all 4 of us collectively in this way, right? Yeah. So the first comment is, for a long time, people who study organizational behavior versus people who study travel behavior, we rarely talk to each other. They're entirely different disciplines, right? For now, I think this is a necessity for us to really work together as a joint understanding of this, right? And practically played out between the tension between employee and employer, but also a city as an agent. All the mayors are trying to getting people back to downtown, right? So how the city government, corporations, and employee, all the 3 entities, how they interact with each other. This is a major question I want to ask. The second one I do want to ask is, how does this mean for transportation operators, right? Particularly for public transit operators, which is really heavily hit on this. For that, I want to mention one conversation I had with the Japanese Railway East, vice chairman. We talked to him 1 year ago. He mentioned to me that as a company, they lost $5 billion in 2020, right? They are a for-profit company. There's no federal government subsidy on this, right? But in the 1 hour conversation, he spent 5 minutes complaining to me about this loss, 55 minutes talking about how brilliant this is an opportunity for him to transform the agency. Because for a long time, he has so many ideas, nobody listened. But now it's the best chance for you to try all these things, right? So how do we see this as a chance to enhance our transportation system because of the pressure? That'll be another question for you. So, Hani, if you can reflect on all the comments.
First of all, I agree with all the comments that have been made. I mean, we're very much aligned in that thinking. And Chandra, I did call it the push and pull between employers and employees. I think ultimately, where hybrid is going is not, as Frank noted earlier, is not evident. I'll give you one anecdote, which is important here, and it kind of confirms a hypothesis that I've had, that any job that one can do 100% remotely, 100% of the time, is a job that is going to, unless it's a super high skill, is a job that is going to a lower paying environment. Because a CEO once said, for every employee who's pushing back about going back in, I'm hiring someone in Colombia for a third of the salary, and so on. And so there is a whole other dimension, I think, on the employment side that might still be unfolding in terms of how hybrid is going to go. From a transportation perspective, I think the whole 2-day thing is very scary to me, because that means that everybody's going to take Wednesday and Friday off, basically, and those other days are going to be even worse from a congestion standpoint. So we haven't accomplished anything unless we kind of can spread that across the various folks. Two other items. This is that Chandra alluded to. We have also been tracking expenditures, and that is indeed fascinating. I didn't get into it here. Now I focus more on sort of the activity travel, but there is quite a bit of related. What your findings are totally on target there. And we also, another piece, but it's limited data, we asked our employers what they were doing in terms of office space. Are they cutting back? Are they getting more? And we were surprised to find that many were actually getting more space. Some were shedding, but many were getting more space because they're finding the opportunity. If you're in downtown New York or downtown Chicago and you have a longer term perspective, you have prime office space, you might as well try to grab it if you are a growing company. And so we're still seeing that as well. So it's not all, I don't think, the cards have been shuffled yet. So, but I want to hear from others. So I'll stop.
Right. Thank you, Hani. Thanks, Hani. Yeah, Bhuvan, so you can curate the question audience.
Thank you, Gino. Fascinating presentation. We'll probably need an hour to go through all the questions, but let's try and get as many in the next 5 minutes. So I think one bunch of questions asked by a lot of people was about, in your survey, how do you ensure everybody's experience is the same? That is, can you normalize for commute, device, connectivity, home size, location, of the home, suburban, rural, and internet connectivity speed? So this was one of the questions a lot of them asked.
So we have information on location. This was meant to be a nationally representative sample. It is in terms of, in terms of urban, rural, age, income, and so on. It's reflective of the national population, but we don't really know how good the internet connection is in somebody's home, frankly. And so there's a lot of detail that is going to be missing, but we try to control for as many of these variables as we can in the analysis itself.
Thank you. Another question a couple of people asked is, would the satisfaction of the employees, be more if they were in control of their proportion of telework versus it being forced upon them, structured versus unstructured hybrid schedules? So can that explain differences in the remote work satisfaction in any way?
A lot of that was still at the time when where people, we're still kind of in immediate post-pandemic kind of, the pandemic was still a major factor. It was early vaccination sort of period. And so there wasn't quite as much of a concern of which days or not. Many were still just working remotely at that particular time. Later on, the questions we asked, yes, I mean, they would prefer to choose their days, but that's where the push and pull is, because now companies that are partially returning to work, they want the entire team to be there, because it does not, it's no use for them to have someone go to work only to sit at their desk on Zoom with the same workers who were supposed to be next to them. The whole point is they want to get them there because it's that interaction that they're missing. So that's why employers want to determine those days. And in fact, groups are realizing that themselves and kind of choosing to really, that's when we all need to be there. If otherwise, let's stay at home and work on Zoom.
Yeah. So just expanding on that, so have you all measured any indices on the outcomes of these remote work policies in terms of productivity for office workers, learning experience, career development? Like there were concerns employees had on career development. And is there a sweet spot between satisfaction due to remote work?
Not yet at this point. We're only asking about, perceptions that people have. We have not, measured that in any objective way. And in fact, employers have not even had the opportunity to fully evaluate that in an objective way. They're getting there. Of course, they look at ultimately profits. And the initial period, some companies were doing so well, they thought everything was going to go great. Now they're not doing so well. They're laying people off. So there's still fluctuating widely. But no, we don't have that information. I wish.
I see Joanne has her hand up, so I'll just ask her to unmute and ask her question. Joanne, please.
You're on mute, Joanne.
Unmute, Joanne, lower left.
Okay. To Sandra's point, what are the individuals doing about this? We're a bunch of researchers, but out my window, the New Mexico legislature at this moment, this week, has two bills. One from individuals who are trying to get permission to telework, to stay from home, which was bypassed. It was not even brought to a vote. The second bill is the governor's preference is to have everybody come back to the office. And what she apparently has done is get a whole collection of managers to come to the legislature next door and push their bill, which is have everybody come back to work on the premise that this is the best way to serve the citizens of New Mexico. So as Chandra says, this is where we are. We're in a tension between the employers and employees, and that's going to affect the outcomes that everyone is now trying to research and get a handle on.
Thanks, John. I'll invite Professor Ching Shen to add your question as well, and then Hani to respond to both. Yeah, Ching, please.
Thank you, Jinhua. Hani, I want to raise this question in connection with my colleague Mike Schiffer's point about nobody talking, thinking about this discussion 5 years ago. And Hani, you remember, and I'm sure quite a few others like Joanne, Pratt, remember year 2007, I organized a special session in TRB, Telecommunication and Travel, with the title of Major Disruption to Personal Travel, Behavior Response and the Role of Telecommunication. And Hani was the main speaker in that session. So I want to point out that was an important topic for some of us years ago. And Hani, the question I for you is, looking back, was there something you think we should have done more differently? Would the result be much different? Because I'm actually, quite frankly, surprised at how relatively small impact this has been.
Hani, please.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think we need another session to discuss it. So I'll duck for now. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot, I think, to be discussed in terms of policy. I think access to technology is a very important one. But had we not been forced to use the technology, we probably would not necessarily have learned it and adopted it. And now that we have, what can we do with it? It also has limitations, because I think this discussion would be much more effective if we were all sitting in, in the same room. So yeah. But I think technology perhaps would be the single most salient point from my standpoint.
And
Yeah,
good
I
point,
wish
Ching.
my
I'm sorry I
colleague,
missed that.
Glenn Leon's work here also would be fun to recall.
This is great. It's past 1 now. So Hani, this is brilliant. Thank you so much. Everybody who joined me, thank Professor Mahmassani for this.
Thank you. By the way, I'd be happy to work through the chat and answer any specific questions that are in there. Bhuvan, if you can, I mean, this will disappear once I log out, but if you could somehow send me the printout,
I'll be sending you the questions in the chat to you, and
I'd be happy to respond by email.
You can save chat, three dots, bottom of the thing. Anybody can save chat.
Save chat.
Yes. Thanks, John. Yeah.
All right.
I'll group the questions and send them to you so that it'll be much
Thank
easier
you.
for you to respond. Yeah.
Thank you.
Honey, if you can stay on for a breakout room, I'll have a
Sure.
quick chat about the logistics.
Okay.
Right. Everyone else, thank you again. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.